In the last days of the Third Reich, while Berlin burned under Soviet bombings, Heinrich Müller, the relentless chief of the Gestapo, vanished without a trace. Neither corpse nor grave nor reliable witnesses. His name remained floating among rumors of secret pacts, hidden files, and espionage networks in the midst of the Cold War. Thus was born the myth of the man without a shadow, an uncomfortable ghost that more than half a century later still embodies the mystery of lost justice. The Ghost of Berlin. The name of Heinrich Müller crossed like a spectre throughout the second half of the 20th century, filled with silences and suspicions. He was last seen in the spring of 1945, when the Third Reich was collapsing under Soviet bombings and the corridors of the Führerbunker were turning into an underground mausoleum. The official version said that he had died in the streets of Berlin, wrapped in the final combats, but each later investigation only corroded that certainty. Years later, in 1963, the exhumation of a grave that bore his name in the Kreuzberg cemetery revealed that Müller did not rest there. Inside the coffin there were bones of 3 different men, none of them the chief of the Gestapo. That discovery unleashed a wave of doubts because it demonstrated that his disappearance had not been the simple outcome of a corpse lost in the chaos of defeat, but something more intricate, perhaps deliberately concealed. Müller was not just any official. Since 1939, he had been at the head of the Gestapo, Amt 4 of the RSHA, with a power that made him indispensable in the repressive machinery of the Reich. His signature appeared on deportation orders, on directives for the shootings of prisoners, on reports about counterintelligence and sabotage. He had turned administrative murder into routine, with stamps, folders, and lists. His bureaucratic efficiency made him an indispensable piece and, at the same time, one of the most wanted criminals after the war. That is why, in the Allied lists of the post-war, he occupied the second place among the fugitives, just below Martin Bormann and above Adolf Eichmann. While Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires and Bormann was declared dead in Berlin after decades of rumors, Müller still failed to appear without trace, like a black hole in the memory of the post-war. His ability to remain invisible was explained in part by his character. He was not a man of tribunes or speeches, but a policeman of Bavarian training, accustomed from the beginning to working in the shadows. The photos that are preserved of him are scarce, almost always in the background, with a stern gesture and impeccable uniform. That habit of living behind files and offices made him less identifiable than other leaders who sought public exposure. The very nickname by which he was called, Gestapo Müller, served to differentiate him from so many other Müllers within the regime, but also reinforced his image of an anonymous figure, of a cog rather than a character. His capacity to disappear was almost an extension of his way of being. After the fall of Berlin, conflicting versions about his fate began to circulate. Some placed him killed by the Soviets in the labyrinth of streets around the Chancellery. Others assured that he had escaped with false documents to Switzerland, where he maintained contacts and accounts. The rumors multiplied that he had died in the basements of the Reich, that he had fled disguised as a common soldier, that he had crossed clandestinely into Tyrol. Each version was reinforced by the absence of proof because there was no corpse, nor belongings, nor witnesses who could certify with certainty what had happened in those days. As the Cold War settled, the mystery acquired another dimension. The figure of Müller became an object of competition among powers. His knowledge of Soviet intelligence, of the agent network known as the Red Orchestra, of the counter-espionage techniques that he had perfected in the Gestapo, made him a coveted piece. On one side, persistent rumors circulated that he had been recruited by the Soviets and transferred to Moscow, where he would have worked for the NKVD. The accusation was no small matter. It meant that the man who had directed the Nazi secret police could have become an advisor to his former enemies. On the other side, scattered reports suggested that he had ended up in the hands of the Americans, absorbed by the network of Reinhard Gehlen, the organization that the CIA used to exploit former Nazi agents in the struggle against communism. In that crossing of hypotheses, the myth of Müller was nourished. What for some was proof of his cunning to survive, for others was the confirmation that justice had been sacrificed in the name of politics. The fact that decades later there were still censored files in the United States and West Germany reinforced the idea that someone had protected his trail. When in 1973 the authorities of the Federal Republic of Germany issued an arrest warrant, convinced that he was still alive, they came up against a wall of silence. The requests for information to Washington received evasive answers. Many documents remained under secrecy, alleging national security. The suspicion of cover-up became inevitable. The silence also came from the Soviet Union. In the years of greatest tension of the Cold War, Moscow had no interest in recognizing the presence of former Nazi leaders in its apparatus. If Müller had really ended up in the Eastern Bloc, it would never be revealed. And if he had not, the mystery served to sow doubts about the honesty of the opposite side. Meanwhile, the figure of the chief of the Gestapo remained relegated to a limbo, a disappeared man whose name continued to appear in the official wanted lists without anyone being able to show a conclusive clue. The brutality of that hunt was measured not so much in armed pursuits as in the persistence of intelligence services that tracked him in every corner of Europe and beyond. Reports arrived from South America, where he was confused with the escape routes of other Nazis, also from the Middle East, where it was said that he had advised Arab governments, and even from the United States, where some claimed that he lived under a false identity. Each rumor triggered investigations that usually ended in nothing but kept the ghost alive. The search was, in reality, a political battlefield. Each power needed to demonstrate that Müller was not on its side, because admitting it meant bearing the stigma of having sheltered the chief of the Gestapo. The shadow of Müller thus became an uncomfortable mirror. It represented the blurry line between justice and convenience. His disappearance showed to what extent the Cold War had disrupted priorities. The same man who had supervised deportations and mass murders could become a valuable asset if he served against the new enemy. That his corpse was never found, that no investigation ever reached a conclusive end, was part of that game. In the destroyed streets of Berlin, among the fragmentary reports of the intelligence services, in the classified files that still keep black erasures, the name of Heinrich Müller continues to be a reminder that the post-war did not close all the wounds, but instead opened others more profound. Number 2, most wanted. When the war ended, the defeat of the Reich left behind a blacklist that seemed endless. The Allies prepared meticulous catalogues of men who had to be found at all costs, responsible for war crimes, deportations, massacres, for having sustained the regime with their iron fist. Among them were well-known leaders, figures who had spoken from balconies and appeared in newsreels: Himmler, Goebbels, Göring. But as some of these committed suicide or fell into enemy hands, others more discreet became priority targets. In that terrain, the name of Heinrich Müller emerged strongly. He was not a visible politician, but the chief of the secret police, an office man who had turned repression into a bureaucratic art. That is why, when the Allied authorities prepared their list of the most wanted criminals, Müller was placed in the second position. Above him only appeared Martin Bormann, Hitler's lieutenant. The administrator of his inner circle also disappeared in the collapse of Berlin. Below, and this makes it even more significant, was Adolf Eichmann, the administrative face of the final solution, who years later would become famous for his capture in Buenos Aires. The order was not casual. It showed that for the Allies, the head of the Gestapo was more dangerous and important than Eichmann himself, because his power had encompassed much more than the logistics of deportations. That place on the list gave him an aura of untouchable. Every time the posters with the faces of the most wanted were published, his face appeared in the second box, with the dark uniform, the neat hairstyle, and the eyes fixed on the target. He was the personification of the Reich's repression, and the fact that there was no body to certify his death made him a potential fugitive. In the post-war press, he was described as a cold man with prodigious memory, capable of recalling details of interrogations that had occurred years earlier. That image reinforced the idea that Müller was not only a criminal on the run, but someone with sufficient capacity to survive hidden for years. The intelligence services considered him a greater trophy than other Nazis who were captured in the immediate months. While Göring surrendered and ended up in the dock at Nuremberg, while Dönitz was arrested as Hitler's improvised successor, Müller seemed to have dissolved into the air. His capacity for organization, together with the files he had supposedly hidden before the collapse, made him a key figure to understand the secrets of Nazism and, even worse, to use them in the board that was opening, the Cold War. A man with precise knowledge of the communist networks, of espionage methods, and of Soviet infiltrations in Europe could be for any power an invaluable tool. His rank on the list transformed him into a ghost that appeared everywhere. Reports came from Austria, from Switzerland, from Spain, from Arab countries. Some placed him in Czechoslovakia, others in Egypt, others in Moscow. That dispersion of rumors was explained in part because the pressure to find him was enormous. Governments wanted to show results. They needed to present proof that they were behind the number 2 most wanted. The absence of concrete clues only multiplied the theories. For many, Müller was the perfect example of how a man could slip through the cracks of the German defeat and escape international justice. Germany itself turned him into a symbol of the shame of not having captured all those responsible. As the death of Himmler, the capture of Kaltenbrunner, and the execution of so many others was confirmed, the figure of Müller remained intact, as if the state that had birthed him still protected him from the shadows. The German police received reports. From time to time, files were reopened, but no investigation came to a good end. That judicial void increased the aura that surrounded him. Justice seemed to be chasing a ghost to which no one could give a definitive form. Being the second most wanted placed him in a different category from other fugitives. Eichmann could hide in Argentina until he was caught in the 60s. Mengele could wander through South America under a false name, but Müller represented a state enigma. He was not only a fugitive, he was the missing piece of the repressive architecture, the man who knew the intimacy of the files, who had been at the Wannsee conference, who had signed extermination documents. That he might still be alive was a threat. That he might be dead without proof was a scandal. In both cases, his place on the list showed that the post-war period was not closed. International pressure to find him intensified as details spread about his direct responsibility in war crimes. Declassified documents showed that he had signed orders to shoot Allied prisoners, that he had coordinated the murder of British officers who escaped from Stalag Luft 3, that he had supervised the deportation machinery toward Auschwitz. His figure, until then grey and administrative, became the face of impunity. The prosecutors who prepared trials in Nuremberg mentioned him frequently, not because they expected to see him in the dock, but because they knew that his name, floating absent, reinforced the idea that justice had to be relentless with those who were present. Fate wanted that, unlike Bormann and Eichmann, a final chapter could never be written about Müller. His place on the list remained as an open wound for decades. The Allies sought him to display him as a trophy, the Germans to close their accounts with the past, the Soviets and Americans to exploit him if possible. That conjunction of interests turned the head of the Gestapo into an eternal fugitive, more powerful by his absence than by his presence. His name, always in the second place of the most wanted, reminded everyone that there was an enemy who had slipped through the rubble of Berlin and who could still be alive, somewhere in the world, protected by those who preferred to take advantage of his secrets rather than bring him to justice. The Gestapo in shadows, Müller and the low profile. Heinrich Müller was not a charismatic orator nor a known face in the newsreels of the Reich. Unlike Himmler, who paraded with his pseudo-mystical speeches about the Black Order, or Goebbels, who fed on contact with the crowds, Müller chose silence as a method of power. His career had trained him in the Bavarian police, where he learned that discretion was a weapon as lethal as the pistol. When he became chief of the Gestapo in 1939, he transferred that same logic to the pinnacle of repression: to remain in the shadows, to let others show their faces while he organized the mechanisms that moved terror. That deliberate choice of a low profile made him an enigmatic character even to his contemporaries. There are hardly any photographs of him. In most, he appears rigid, with the impeccable uniform, but always as part of a group in the background, almost never at the center of the image. He did not seek light, but rather the penumbra. In the corridors of the RSHA, he was known as a tireless worker with prodigious memory, capable of recalling complete files without needing to consult them. His authority did not come from harangues or theatrical gestures, but from the bureaucratic precision with which he directed interrogations, issued orders, and supervised deportations. That way of being present without exposing himself was reflected in his signature. Documents that meant death for hundreds of people bore the dry stroke of I.A. Müller, abbreviation of in Auftrag, as if it were just another procedure. He never added words, never adorned the paper. He was the invisible hand behind the machinery. While other Nazi leaders left recorded speeches or printed proclamations, Müller reduced himself to initials and signatures. That austerity protected him. It made it difficult to trace his thinking, reconstruct his character, or even identify his face outside the institutional context. When the Reich collapsed in 1945, that quality made him even more difficult to track. Most Nazi criminals were known because they had sought fame or notoriety. Eichmann had participated in public conferences. Mengele had a name associated with experiments in Auschwitz. Bormann had been the visible shadow of Hitler in the offices of the party. Müller, on the other hand, was a man whose biography seemed to vanish in the monotony of police reports. For Nazi hunters, he was like chasing a shadow without defined contours. His very way of living had prepared his involuntary escape. There are no clear testimonies of having seen him in the final days of Berlin beyond a couple of mentions in the bunker. He disappeared with the same ease with which he had remained invisible for years. The scarcity of photographs complicated later searches. Every time a Müller was reported detected somewhere, there was no sure way to confirm his identity. In the Allied files, cards with vague descriptions accumulated: man of medium height, dark hair, occasional glasses, features too generic for someone who had been the second most wanted man on the planet. That opaque character earned him the nickname of the man without a shadow. No one could follow him because he had never left a clear silhouette in the public scene. There were no recorded speeches, no interviews, no photos in parades, only files, signatures, and rumors. That void fed conspiracy theories. Some claimed that he had committed suicide in Berlin, others that he lived in Moscow advising the NKVD, others that he had been absorbed by the CYA through the Gehlen organization. All those versions started from the same difficulty: the impossibility of reconstructing a public biography that could give clues about his whereabouts. The curious thing is that this invisibility was not passive, but cultivated with intention. Müller understood that real power resided in the control of information and not in exposure. While other leaders sought the Führer's validation through their constant presence, he made sure to be indispensable without attracting too much attention. That strategy made him less vulnerable. When the Allies prepared the accusations in Nuremberg, they barely had graphic or discursive material to exhibit him. In a world that needed images to exemplify justice, Müller was a void difficult to show. With the passage of time, that quality became almost legendary. He survived in memory as the archetype of the bureaucrat of evil, the official who does not need speeches, nor visible fanaticism, nor ideological exaltations, but only the coldness of the office. The paradox is that that very sobriety made him an impossible fugitive to catch. He left no emotional traces, had no retinue that could betray him, did not seek refuges where he could be recognized. He was, even before disappearing, a man who had made anonymity his best hiding place. The lack of photographs was so decisive that in the 1960s, when investigations about his whereabouts resumed, the press could barely illustrate the reports with a blurry image from the 1930s. While Eichmann appeared with a defined face on the front pages after his capture, Müller remained a diffuse profile, almost a myth. Even today, his image does not easily fix itself in the collective memory, which makes him even more elusive. In the post-war, people could recognize Göring or Goebbels, but not the chief of the Gestapo. That voluntary anonymity, cultivated with patience during the years of Nazi power, became his best defense. The shadow he had built throughout his career turned after 1945 into a cloak of invisibility. And so, while others were judged, executed, or captured in remote places, Heinrich Müller vanished into the penumbra he had always chosen, leaving behind the uncomfortable question of whether he had died in silence or if he still walked, unrecognizable, under another identity. The CIA and Müller's treasure, the SD files. In the last months of the Reich, while bombs fell on Berlin and the ministries burned among mountains of flaming paper, the rumor spread that Heinrich Müller had set aside certain files before destruction consumed everything. The idea that the chief of the Gestapo, meticulous like few, would let disappear the information that had made him powerful seemed absurd to many post-war investigators. If something characterized Müller, it was his obsession with records. Every interrogation, every surveillance report, every list of informants passed through his desk and was recorded in folders that piled up in the basements of Prinz Albrechtstrasse. That is why, when he was spoken of after 1945, not only was the missing man mentioned, but also the impossible documents that he had supposedly rescued. The rumors were so insistent that they soon became part of his legend. Some witnesses claimed that Müller had given orders to separate certain boxes before the systematic burning of files began. Others affirmed that he had copies kept in safe houses, even outside Germany. The truth is that no one could ever prove it with evidence, but the possibility was so believable that the intelligence services did not stop pursuing it. Those papers could contain lethal secrets, identities of double agents, spy networks in Europe, details of covert operations that had cost the lives of hundreds of opponents. The most widespread hypothesis maintained that part of those files had ended up in Switzerland. Müller maintained contacts with bankers and businessmen who served him as financial intermediaries, and some investigators believed that he had used those connections to send sensitive documents to Geneva or Zurich, along with funds destined for a possible exile. In the post-war period, versions circulated that folders with the Gestapo seal had appeared in private Swiss offices, discreetly offered to foreign buyers. None of that could be confirmed in court, but the echoes were enough to shape the suspicion that Müller had turned information into currency for survival. That idea intensified with the arrival of the Cold War. The papers that Müller would have saved were of as much or more interest than his person. In them could be found, they said, data about the Red Orchestra, the Soviet espionage network that had operated in the heart of Germany during the war, as well as reports on communist infiltrations in neutral countries. With that knowledge, any intelligence service could get ahead of the adversary. Both the KGB and the CIA had interest in obtaining them, and there arose the dilemma. If Müller had negotiated his impunity by handing over those documents, his silence and his disappearance could be deliberately protected. The testimonies of some former RSHA officials reinforced the theory. A subordinate declared in 1947 that Müller always carried a closed briefcase with him, even in the most chaotic days of April of 45. He did not allow anyone to inspect it. No one ever knew what it contained, but the memory of that briefcase became one more piece of the puzzle. Were they orders for the last defenders of Berlin, or were they lists of agents, proof of covert operations that later would have served him to negotiate with whoever was willing to offer him refuge? Speculation became more intense when supposed fragments of those files began to appear in Western reports. Investigators pointed out coincidences between Nazi counter-espionage data and documents used by American intelligence in the 1950s. Others believed they recognized German seals in papers seized from Soviet defectors. Nothing was conclusive, but the simple fact that versions of that kind circulated suggested that in some way Müller's information had survived and had changed hands. For the Nazi hunters, the possibility that Müller kept files was doubly disturbing. Not only did it imply that he could guarantee his own protection, but that he could also blackmail those who sheltered him. He knew too much, and those secrets could compromise entire governments. At a time when the line between executioners and allies blurred, with ex-Nazis integrated into Western intelligence through Reinhard Gehlen's network, having Müller as the holder of uncomfortable information was an enormous risk. The myth of the files grew to the point of becoming a recurring explanation for everything unknown. If Müller's body was not found, it was because someone protected him in exchange for papers. If the Gestapo documents did not appear complete, it was because they had been sold or exchanged in secret. If governments refused to declassify certain reports, it was because in them was the proof of that pact. The absence of solid evidence became, paradoxically, the food of suspicion. In West Germany, prosecutors and judges reopened several times the search for Müller with the hope of finding those documents. In 1967, when some CIA reports were declassified, the German press asked if there might not be traces of Müller in them. The evasive answers reinforced the idea that more than a fugitive, he was a hidden asset. The rumors that he had lived in Switzerland, protected by financial contacts, intersected with the hypothesis that he had been in Moscow, handing those same papers to the Soviets. The result was always the same, a web of contradictions where no one could close the story. The symbolic weight of those files was enormous. In them was condensed the nucleus of Müller's power, information as a tool of control. Just as in life he had used records to subjugate millions of people, in the post-war period he could use them to keep himself out of the reach of justice. The mere possibility that they existed and were hidden in some vault or distributed in secret envelopes among rival agencies reinforced the ghostly character of his figure. Heinrich Müller was not only a disappeared man, he was also the guardian of invisible papers that could explain both his fate and the silence that surrounded him for decades. Müller, the new mole of the KGB. In the years after 1945, the name of Heinrich Müller began to revolve around a dichotomy that seemed taken from a spy novel. Had he fled to the east to serve the Soviet Union, or had he ended up at the service of the United States on the new board of the Cold War? That question was not trivial, because Müller was not just any Nazi. He had directed the Gestapo, knew the intricacies of the Red Orchestra, the network of communist spies that operated in the heart of Germany, and had participated in counterintelligence operations whose echo was still felt. His disappearance was the perfect breeding ground for theories to multiply. From the first months of the post-war, versions circulated that placed him in Moscow. Some defectors from the Eastern Bloc claimed to have seen him in NKVD facilities, integrated as a counselor in security matters. It was said that his knowledge of police structures, of methods of infiltration and torture was too valuable for the Soviets to let him escape. Walter Schellenberg, chief of foreign intelligence of the RSHA, hinted shortly before dying that Müller had been absorbed by the Russians. His testimony, although ambiguous, reinforced the narrative that the chief of the Gestapo had become a sort of trophy of the Kremlin. The idea seemed plausible. The Soviets had captured dozens of Nazi officers in Berlin and used them as bargaining pieces. That Müller was among them seemed logical, but soon the opposite version appeared, woven in the corridors of Washington. The Gehlen organization, created by General Reinhard Gehlen, former chief of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, began working with the CIA. In that context, it was rumored that Müller had been secretly recruited, protected under a false identity, and that he collaborated in the hunt for Soviet spies in Western Europe. The hypothesis was disturbing. It meant that the United States had offered refuge to the man who embodied Nazi repression. However, the logic of the Cold War made it plausible. If Gehlen and his men, many with dark pasts, could become allies, why not Müller, with his mental archive of communist networks and his experience in police control? Defenders of this version pointed to silence is too convenient. Every time German prosecutors asked the United States for information about Müller, they received evasive answers. Documents that could clarify his fate remained redacted or classified for reasons of national security. That secrecy fed the suspicion that the CIA had integrated him into its operations. In the mid-50s, rumors even circulated that he lived on a United States military base under another name, training agents in interrogation techniques. No solid proof emerged, but the persistence of shadows strengthened the belief that Washington had absorbed him. The struggle of theories became a reflection of the Cold War itself. For the Westerners, it was convenient to insinuate that Müller was in Moscow, turned into a servant of the Red Enemy. For the Soviets, it was useful to spread the opposite idea, that Müller collaborated with the Americans, proving the hypocrisy of Washington's anti-Nazi discourse. On both sides, Müller was a ghost that served as a propaganda weapon. No one wanted to recognize him officially, but everyone benefited from his absence. The truth is that his figure fit in both scenarios. In Moscow, he would have been a valuable advisor to consolidate the internal control systems that Stalin was already applying. In Washington, he would have served as an expert in counterinsurgency and espionage at a time when the fear of communism was total. His knowledge of clandestine communist networks in Central Europe was of a caliber that few could match. That double usefulness explained why neither version could be completely discarded. Official investigations never managed to settle the dilemma. In 1973, when West Germany reactivated the search and issued an arrest warrant, the powers did not offer clear answers. Every file consulted was incomplete. Every clue ended in a dead end. The very silence was interpreted as confirmation. If Müller was dead in Berlin, why so much secrecy? The hypothesis that he had negotiated his survival, handing over information or files in exchange for refuge, became almost a consensus. What no one could determine was in which direction that pact had been. At this point, the legend fed on contradictions. Those who placed him in Moscow spoke of his pragmatism. Müller had demonstrated loyalty only to his work, not to an ideology, and that would have made him useful to Stalin. Those who imagined him in the hands of the CIA relied on his hatred of communism, cultivated since his time in the Bavarian police, and on the precedent of other Nazis recycled as Western informants. In both accounts, what stood out was his capacity for adaptation, that coldness that had made him survive at the top of Nazi terror. In the end, the figure of Müller remained split in two, trapped between Moscow and Langley, between the Soviet archive and the classified United States document. The official story never gave a definitive answer, and in that ambiguity his myth was built. Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, was remembered both as a fugitive and as a possible undercover agent, a man who had turned his disappearance into a political weapon. The question of where he ended up, whether in the offices of the NKVD or in the basements of the CIA, continues floating as one of the most unsettling enigmas of the 20th century. The testimony of Schellenberg. Walter Schellenberg, last chief of the Reich's Foreign Security Service, died in 1952 in Turin, consumed by cancer. Before dying, he left memoirs and some comments to journalists and Allied officers that ended up fueling one of the most persistent hypotheses about Heinrich Müller, that he had ended up in Soviet hands. Schellenberg had known closely the functioning of the RSHA and therefore the enigmatic figure of Gestapo Müller. His word was not that of just any witness. He had been inside the apparatus, had shared meetings and directives with the heaviest names of Nazism. When he hinted that Müller had not died in Berlin but had been captured by the NKVD, the shadow of that statement spread like gunpowder. In those years, the fate of many Nazi leaders was still in dispute. Bormann had not been identified, Mengele moved around South America, Eichmann lived under a false identity. The death of Schellenberg, accompanied by his final comment about Müller, gave an almost prophetic weight to the Soviet version. According to him, Müller was too valuable to disappear among the rubble of the Reich. He had directed internal repression for years and, above all, had had direct access to the investigations about the Red Orchestra. That communist espionage network, which had managed to infiltrate the Nazi state itself, was for Moscow a treasure worth more than the life of any German officer. Capturing the man who possessed the most information about it meant shielding the security of the Eastern Bloc. Schellenberg's statement was interpreted as an involuntary confession. He himself had ended up arranging his surrender to the Allies, trying to save himself with information. He knew firsthand how, in that chaos of 1945, both Washington and Moscow were eager to absorb what remained of the Nazi intelligence apparatus. If Schellenberg had found his own path to the British, why would Müller not have done so with the Soviets? The logic was forceful. Both were men of records, of files, of secrets that could be turned into currency. The Soviet hypothesis also had propagandistic appeal. For the West, that Müller had been captured by the NKVD and protected in Moscow was a direct accusation against the Red Enemy. It meant that the Kremlin was sheltering the chief of the Gestapo and using him in its power structure. For the Eastern Bloc, on the other hand, it was a show of its ability to absorb the enemy, to reconvert him into a tool. The ambiguity served both sides. Schellenberg, perhaps unintentionally, had given credibility to that narrative simply with his testimony. The truth is that he never presented proof. There were no names of officers who had seen him, nor documents that confirmed a transfer. His comment was barely a hint, but the weight of his figure turned it into half-truth. The Nazi hunters took it as a starting point. In the 1960s and 70s, when the German press spoke again about Müller, it was repeated again and again that Schellenberg had pointed to his escape to Moscow. That phrase, repeated without context, grew until it became a pillar of the legend. Schellenberg's testimony also fit with the perception many had of Müller. A man without ideological loyalty, obsessed with police work rather than Nazi doctrine. His origin as a Bavarian official, alien to Hitlerian mysticism, reinforced the idea that he could have changed sides without problems. If he had served Hitler efficiently, he could also serve Stalin with the same coldness. Schellenberg's insinuation only gave shape to that suspicion. For post-war investigators, the problem was that every word of Schellenberg was tinged with interests. His memoirs sought to justify his own decisions, soften his role in the machinery of terror, and present himself as a pragmatic man trapped in circumstances. To speak of Müller as a prisoner of the NKVD perhaps served to shift suspicions, to point to another, and incidentally, to give his own contacts in the West one more argument against the Soviet enemy. However, the rumor was too juicy to be discarded. Over time, that confession became part of the Müller file. Every time a new document about his disappearance appeared, Schellenberg's words were remembered. Thus, what had begun as a phrase launched on the deathbed of a Nazi leader was transformed into one of the pillars of the Soviet theory. Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, would have crossed from the shadows of Berlin to the offices of Moscow, protected by those who had been his enemies in the war. The most disturbing thing was that this hypothesis was never refuted with force. No one found his corpse in Berlin, no one presented proof of his flight to the West. The silence of the Soviet archives, added to the classification of documents in the United States, kept the suspicion alive. And in the center of everything, like an echo repeated without end, was the voice of Schellenberg confirming before dying that Müller had changed sides. The hunt in the archives. In 1973, almost 3 decades after the fall of Berlin, the name of Heinrich Müller once again emerged forcefully from the dusty basements of German justice. By then, many of the great Nazi leaders were dead, imprisoned, or had been judged. Eichmann had been kidnapped in Buenos Aires and executed in Jerusalem in 1962. Bormann had been confirmed dead thanks to forensic evidence found in Berlin. Himmler, Goebbels, and Göring were already historical corpses, but Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, was still a ghost. The prosecution of West Germany decided that the only way to close that wound was to officially reopen his search and issue a new international arrest warrant. That gesture had enormous symbolic force. It placed Müller, almost 30 years later, at the center of the stage. It meant that the Federal Republic of Germany recognized that the man who had directed the most brutal repression of the Reich could not be buried in oblivion just because his body never appeared. The order was clear. He was sought alive as a fugitive, and any authority had to arrest him if the opportunity arose. It was also a message for public opinion. Germany was not going to tolerate that the shadow of Müller became synonymous with impunity. The problem began when that order collided against the invisible walls of the great powers. The German prosecution requested information from the United States about Müller, convinced that the CIA archives contained relevant data. What they received were evasive answers. Incomplete documents, pages blacked out with ink, references suppressed under the formula of national security. Each silence only reinforced the suspicion that Müller had had contact with Western intelligence services. Why, if he was dead in Berlin, so much zeal to hide the information? The same pattern was repeated with the Soviet Union. The German authorities asked Moscow for cooperation, which denied having him in its custody but never provided proof of his death. The Soviet silence was as dense as the American one. Neither side was willing to open its intelligence archives, and Müller, consequently, still had no clear fate. For the prosecutors, that was exasperating. They needed certainties but only received shadows. The investigators then began a hunt in the archives. They compiled witness reports, post-war documents, occupation service records. Cemeteries were tracked, graves exhumed, bones compared. In all cases, the result was the same. The remains did not correspond to Müller. Each negative increased the intrigue. The more time passed, the more improbable it seemed that he had died in Berlin without leaving a trace. In the press, the matter exploded as a scandal. The German newspapers published articles asking why the CIA refused to declassify the documents about Müller. Some journalists suggested that the Americans had recruited him, just as they had done with other Nazis in the Gehlen organization, and that keeping him hidden was part of a pact of silence. The hypothesis was disturbing, but it was sustained in the logic of the Cold War. Müller had held in his hands vital information about communist networks, and that made him too valuable an asset to be discarded. At the same time, critical voices accused Moscow of having captured him and of keeping him as a prisoner in some basement of the Lubyanka. The rumor that Walter Schellenberg had seen him under Soviet custody still circulated, reinforcing the theory that Müller had changed sides. The German arrest warrant in that context seemed to collide against a wall of geopolitical conveniences. No power wanted to confirm or deny anything. For the Nazi hunters, the hunt in the archives became an obsession. Simon Wiesenthal, among others, pressed for more files to be opened, convinced that Müller was alive. The idea that the chief of the Gestapo had escaped justice was intolerable. The file of 1973 was one of the moments when the name of Müller once again circulated intensely in the collective memory. He was no longer just a fugitive, he was the living proof that the post-war was plagued with secrets. Each incomplete file, each censored page became indirect proof that something was being hidden. The arrest warrant, instead of closing the case, expanded it. It was as if, upon opening the drawers of bureaucracy, a swarm of impossible questions had been released. Why did the CIA have files on Müller so carefully hidden? Why did Moscow prefer absolute silence? How deep had been the use of former Nazis on the board of the Cold War? Thus, the hunt was transformed into a metaphor. It was not only a man who had disappeared in 1945 that was being pursued, but an entire truth that resisted coming to light. Müller was already a symbol. The chief of the Gestapo turned into a ghost of the post-war, protected by the fog of secret archives. In 1973, German justice tried to unmask him with a signed paper, with an international arrest warrant. The only thing it achieved was to demonstrate once again that ghosts cannot be trapped with stamps or decrees, and that sometimes the silence of the archives can be more eloquent than any testimony. The man without a shadow. As the years passed, Heinrich Müller ceased to be only a fugitive from justice to become a myth, a spectre that history baptized as the man without a shadow. There was no corpse, no grave, no conclusive witnesses. Only a few blurry photographs remained, some dry signature in Gestapo documents and a handful of contradictory testimonies. It was as if the most feared figure of the Nazi secret police had decided to evaporate, erase his tracks and slip into oblivion with the same efficiency with which he had directed the apparatus of terror. That nickname, without a shadow, was not a poetic exaggeration but the confirmation of an emptiness. Unlike other leaders of the Third Reich, Müller never cultivated a public image. There were no fiery speeches authored by him, nor official portraits that turned him into an iconic face, nor filmed harangues that immortalized him in newsreels. His power was exercised in closed corridors, in offices filled with records, in orders signed with impersonal initials. His authority had been built in silence, in the coldness of bureaucracy, in the invisibility that now, in the post-war period, turned him into a ghost. The press of the 1950s and 60s evoked him always in the same way, the chief of the Gestapo who disappeared. There were no nuances, no recent images, only a name that evoked fear. Journalists strove to reconstruct his profile, but what they found was always fragmentary. A modest childhood in Bavaria, a career in the local police, a rapid rise in the Nazi machinery thanks to his efficiency as an investigator, and afterwards silence. No passions, no scandals, no personal accounts. Müller was an empty file, a functionary who had made anonymity his most resistant shield. That emptiness was transformed into fertile ground for speculation. Every state silence reinforced the legend. When the CIA refused to declassify its files, when Moscow responded with evasions, when West Germany issued arrest warrants that never materialized, everything seemed to confirm that Müller was not an ordinary fugitive but a man protected by the shadows. No one saw him, no one found him, no one showed him. His figure became more powerful through absence than through presence. The nickname also reflected a psychological phenomenon. The most visible executioners of Nazism, Goebbels, Himmler, Göring, had remained inscribed in collective memory as recognizable symbols. People could see their faces and associate them with horror. Müller, on the other hand, lacked that clear representation. His invisibility made him more unsettling. He was the proof that true violence could be exercised from the shadows, without the need for grandiloquent speeches or public appearances. He was the bureaucrat of evil in its purest state, the one who did not need to shine because he was content to move the pieces from behind the curtain. The metaphor of man without a shadow was consolidated as time passed without news. Decade after decade, the case remained open without resolution. Meanwhile, new generations grew up hearing his name as a distant echo, a riddle without an answer. There were no witnesses who could tell with certainty his fate. Every rumor that he had been seen in Moscow, in Switzerland, or in an American base, instead of clarifying, increased the haze. His life after 1945 was like a stage lit by intermittent spotlights where his figure never appeared. The strength of the myth lay not only in physical disappearance but in what it symbolized. Müller represented the border between justice and politics, between the need to clarify and the interest to conceal. His absent shadow reminded that in the post-war period there were secrets more valuable than transparency, and that some men could disappear from the map in exchange for what they knew. His condition of without a shadow was not only a personal destiny, it was a symptom of how the Cold War turned truth into merchandise and memory into a battlefield. And thus, while other Nazis were captured, judged, or discovered in exotic corners, Müller continued inhabiting the territory of the invisible. A name, a signature, an absence. A man who never allowed the light to trap him and who, for that very reason, became the most unsettling figure of the post-war period, the chief of the Gestapo who never cast a shadow. The pressure of the Cold War. When the weapons fell silent in 1945, the world believed that an era of trials, of clear accounts, of definitive closure was opening. However, the reality was different. The outbreak of the Cold War turned many criminals of the Reich into coveted pieces for the new confrontation between East and West. On that board of espionage, propaganda, and nuclear fear, Heinrich Müller became a useful ghost. His disappearance left a gap where each power could project its own interests. In the first years of the post-war, while the Nuremberg trials set precedents, the intelligence agencies were being reconfigured. The CIA was born on the ruins of the OSS, and the NKVD was consolidated as the most feared police apparatus of the USSR. In that context, Müller was an invisible trophy. No one could present proof of his death, so everyone could suspect that he had survived. And if he had survived, it was inevitable to ask on which side he was now. For Washington, the shadow of Müller was a reminder of what an enemy turned into an ally could offer. Reinhard Gehlen and his network of former Nazi agents had already been incorporated to spy on the Eastern Bloc. Why not Müller, who knew like no one else the mechanisms of repression, the techniques of interrogation, and the networks of communist espionage? Every time journalists or prosecutors asked about him, the silences and the blacked-out lines in the American archives fed the suspicion. Was it simply the protection of secrets or proof that they had recycled him under another name? For Moscow, the usefulness was different. It was said that the NKVD had captured him in Berlin and was keeping him in some basement of the Lubyanka, interrogating him without rest. Müller knew too much about the Red Orchestra, that network of Soviet spies that had managed to infiltrate Nazi Germany and survive the purges. To have him in their hands meant not only avenging an enemy, but shielding their future operations. In the rumors that circulated in the West, Müller appeared as Stalin's secret advisor, contributing to the perfection of the Soviet repressive system. The disturbing thing was that both versions served the propaganda of each bloc. For the West, spreading that Müller was in Moscow demonstrated the immorality of communism, capable of embracing the chief of the Gestapo. For the Soviets, suggesting that he lived protected by the United States served to accuse Washington of hypocrisy. The same ones who spoke of justice were harboring Nazi executioners. Thus, the figure of Müller became a political weapon, a myth molded by the pressure of the new global conflict. In West Germany, the situation was even more complex. The Federal Republic was trying to build a democracy on the foundations of a ruined past, and the shadow of Müller was an uncomfortable reminder that not everything had been resolved. Every time prosecutors issued an arrest warrant, they stumbled against the wall of international silence. The Bonn government itself knew that stirring the case too much could destabilize relations with its allies. To speak of Müller was to speak of the tacit complicity in the recycling of former Nazis, and at the same time it was to recognize that German justice was still incapable of catching its most wanted criminal. The myth of the man without a shadow intertwined with that tension. Müller was useful because no one could prove anything. He could be in Moscow, in Washington, or dead under the rubble of Berlin, and each possibility served a different discourse. The Cold War needed invisible enemies, spies impossible to capture, figures that kept societies on edge. In that scenario, the figure of Müller fit perfectly. He was the most convenient, disappeared man. The shadow that confirmed that the world was divided into grey zones where truth mattered less than political usefulness. The pressure intensified every time files were requested. In the 70s, when the arrest warrant was renewed, the CIA refused to declassify documents alleging national security. That argument was enough to feed the suspicion that Müller had been integrated into clandestine operations. The same occurred in the Soviet bloc. Moscow's silence was so absolute that it was suspicious. If he had died in Berlin, why not present definitive proof? The secrecy of both sides only added layers of mystery to an already dense case. The Cold War thus turned Müller into a kind of symbol of the price of geopolitics. The chief of the Gestapo, responsible for atrocious crimes, could have ended up protected not out of loyalty but out of convenience. In a polarized world, where intelligence was more valuable than justice, his fate remained suspended in an untouchable zone. The pressure was not exerted only on his search, but on truth itself. Each power shaped his disappearance according to its interests, and justice was relegated to a second plane. Decades later, when German historians reviewed the case, they always reached the same conclusion. The Cold War had buried any possibility of clarifying his whereabouts. It did not matter so much whether he was alive or dead, but the fact that his name had been manipulated as a political tool. Heinrich Müller had ceased to be a man to become a shadow projected between Washington and Moscow, a reminder that truth was another victim of that global confrontation. The uncomfortable legacy. The story of Heinrich Müller did not end in the ruins of Berlin nor in the basements of the Gestapo that he himself had directed. His absence, more than his life, became an uncomfortable legacy that spanned generations. Decades after 1945, when the world had already seen walls fall, new powers emerge, and global politics transform, Müller's name still resonated as an unanswered question. It was the demonstration that the Nazi past did not close abruptly, but remained open in poorly stitched scars, where some executioners were lost among the bureaucracy of the post-war period and the convenience of the Cold War. That legacy was uncomfortable in the first place for Germany. The Federal Republic needed to build a narrative of justice to demonstrate that the new state would not repeat the crimes of the past. But the more it consolidated itself as a Western democracy, the heavier weighed the shadow of the never-captured chief of the Gestapo. Each anniversary of the end of the war, each commemoration of Nuremberg, his name resurfaced like a stain impossible to erase. Germany could show itself as a country reconciled with democracy, but Müller's escape reminded that the ghosts of the Reich still wandered without being held accountable. The legacy was also uncomfortable for the victorious powers. The United States and the Soviet Union had built their image as guardians of the free world or of just socialism upon the defeat of Nazism. But the Müller case suggested the opposite, that in the name of politics, justice could be silenced. If he had ended up in Moscow, it meant that the Kremlin had harbored an executioner in exchange for information. If he had ended up in the hands of the CIA, it meant that Washington had recycled the chief of the Gestapo as a cog in its struggle against communism. In both scenarios, morality was overshadowed by convenience. The uncomfortable thing about Müller was not only that he disappeared, but that he did so as one of the most wanted men on the planet. He was not a minor officer, a field doctor, or a secondary bureaucrat. He was the director of the secret police, responsible for thousands of murders, the administrative brain behind deportations and political repression. His absence in the Nuremberg trials was a void that could never be filled. Each defendant could point upward and say, "I followed orders." But the one who signed those orders, the one who organized that repression, never sat in the dock. With the passage of time, Müller's figure became a metaphor for the pact of silence that surrounded so many war crimes. In both East and West, his name served as a reminder that there were executioners who managed to negotiate with their past, who hid behind classified documents, or who were protected by interests that surpassed any notion of justice. It was uncomfortable because it pointed to a collective wound, that of societies that proclaimed never to forget, but that in reality were willing to look the other way if information or convenience demanded it. The legacy also extended toward the memory of the victims. For the survivors of repression, knowing that Müller never faced a tribunal was an affront. The man who had ordered tortures, summary executions, deportations, had vanished without leaving a trace. The symbolic justice of the Nuremberg trials seemed incomplete as long as his name kept floating in the wanted lists. Each crossed-out archive page, each refusal to declassify documents, was a way of prolonging his power beyond death. In post-war culture, Müller embodied the figure of the perfect criminal, not because his crimes were impeccable, but because he had managed to disappear from the stage. While other Nazis were associated with concrete images, the suicide of Himmler, the gallows of Nuremberg, the capture of Eichmann, Müller represented the indeterminate. That indeterminacy made him more unsettling. He was the proof that evil could survive in silence, without a face, without punishment. The uncomfortable legacy is perceived even today in the way his case continues generating investigations, documentaries, hypotheses. Müller is not remembered only as a Nazi leader, but as a symbol of impunity. His unknown fate is an open wound that exposes the limitations of international justice. It demonstrates that history is not always written with clear endings and that the greatest crimes can dissolve into the grey of political interests. The most disturbing thing about his legacy is that his disappearance was not only an individual escape, but a reflection of a system. Müller embodies the dark zone where justice and power intersect and cancel each other out. His figure reminds that Nazism did not end in 1945 in a clean way, but infiltrated the new war, taking advantage of its networks, its information, and the moral ambiguity of a divided world. In that uncomfortable continuity, the chief of the Gestapo continues to be, even today, a reminder of what happens when truth becomes negotiable and memory is sacrificed in the name of convenience.